Tom, hi, it's great to see you again. I know we've seen you in the past in the cul-de-sac on your beautiful 69 Bonneville, and thank you so much for inviting me over to your place today. And for our Triumph fans, I hope they'll excuse the BSA sign in the background, but we're here to see an amazing Triumph of Tom's.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome everybody. I'd like to talk a little bit about my 1949 Triumph Grand Prix race bike. Many of you who have been Triumph collectors and Triumph enthusiasts for years may not have heard of a bike like this. I know before I got involved with this project, I really knew nothing about these early Grand Prix race bikes. So I thought I would talk a little bit about the history and some of the features of the bike so that you could get a little bit of a background and maybe help with getting your education on the Triumphs a little bit deeper. This is a factory race bike that Triumph made. It was actually, I believe, the first post-war Triumph race bike that was done by the factory, and of course led to many others later in the 50s and 60s. Of course, Triumph has a glorious history of racing. The genesis of this is that a fellow named Ernie Lyons, who's a Irish potato farmer, won the 1946 IOM TT on a prototype of this bike. It was basically a T100 frame and motor, bottom end, and they used, if you can notice, this has the square barrel top end on it. So they used that because of the lightweight of being aluminum head and aluminum barrels. Edward Turner, who was managing director and chief engineer at the time for Triumph, he was not a race fan, and he thought that spending money on race bikes was a waste of time. And so this was kind of done under the table so that Mr. Turner didn't see what was going on. So anyway, they put this together, and I think he had help from the Triumph development factory. And he went out and won the 1946 race there at the Isle of Man. That created a lot of excitement amongst Triumph enthusiasts. And, you know, it was just after the war, everybody was trying to get back to normal and wanted to do fun things. And so with that success, there was a pretty high demand for creating more of these bikes. And so Edward Turner finally agreed to build a run of race bikes based on that prototype. So that's what this was. They built these from 1949 and 1950. The records that I've been able to obtain seem to show that they built 151 of these over that 2-year period. And they built 15 spare motors that could be used in the racing when if they blow up a motor. And a lot of these that came to the US were used mostly for the Daytona racing, and then it was used in other road racing in the US as well. This was a kind of a special, they really hopped this thing up, and many of you may be familiar with the square barrel motor. It was developed under a government contract with the British government to build a portable generator for the RAF bombers. And so they made it out of aluminum, which was kind of a new technology at the time, so that they could make it lightweight and make it portable so they could charge the batteries on the RAF bombers. So after the war, they had this interesting piece, and so they were trying to figure out what to do with it. And of course, when Ernie Lyons won the Isle of Man with this combination, that's what they decided to use. They have designed this thing with 2 carburetors so that it could get better breathing. They used larger valves, a larger valve train intake. I believe they also used sodium-filled exhaust valves, trying to keep this thing as cool as possible on the racing circuit. They kind of pulled out the stops on this, and so a lot of items that are one of for this particular race machine, which made the restoration of this quite challenging. With all the configuration that they did with this, they were able to get basically 40 horsepower out of this. And it was a pretty competitive machine. At the time, mostly what was being raced in the road racing was famous singles like the Norton Manx and the Gold Star. Yeah. This was one of the first pre-war bikes that was a multi-cylinder that raced in that Grand Prix circuit. It was pretty competitive against the Norton Manx at that time, until Norton came out in 1950 with the featherbed frame. And then it was a whole other game after that, because they could handle so much better and do the turns so much faster that This bike, even though it had maybe a little more horsepower, the old rigid frame just wasn't up to the same standards as the featherbed. So this became not very competitive after that. But during that reign, it did pretty well. It was kind of fragile because it really wasn't race developed. So if they flogged it too hard, it would have a tendency to come apart on you. So but it kind of started the era of Triumph Racing post-war period. And there are a lot of things they did to it. There's a number of things in terms of details. This tank is a large tank that they used so that they didn't have to stop for fuel too often. It basically has the same shape at the top as the early Thunderbirds or some of the big tanks that were done without the panel in the tank. And what they did is they added about 2 or 3 inches to the bottom so they could get more capacity. And they also used baffles inside so that when they were making the turns, it wouldn't slosh so much. And they also put a large fuel filler here. This is a 3-inch flip-top fuel filter to get the gas in more. This particular tank is an original Grand Prix tank, which are really hard to come by. This one, I found it from a friend of mine in Massachusetts who found it under a porch, and it was all bashed up. And he had some body work done on it, and when I finally got to doing this, I had to have more body work done on it. So there's a lot of tender loving care into this particular tank. And you notice the chin rest here, because when they were up on the boil, the racer would sit back on the pillion seat. GP race frame has rear sets, and so you'd sit back on it and rest your chin there and try to get as low profile as you can and go like stink. Normally the shifter would be moving forward from the transmission, but because of the rear sets, they flipped it around. So if you ride this, you got to think first gear is up, yes, and the others are down.
It's like a Norton then.
Like a Norton, yes. Other specialty things on this, they had a pre-war RC83 racing tack with the early pre-war logo in there. The seat is a rubber Dunlop racing seat, which is a pretty rare item to find, and I happened to find this. Usually they're all checked and cracked, and this one was really in nice shape, so it was great to find. They used a bigger oil tank. It had a 1-gallon capacity with a frothing tower, and then it had a big filler on this thing. There's several versions of this that you'll see in different manifestations. One for the race kit that came after these bikes, and then there was one for the 53 Triumph T100C, which used a lot of the racing components from this era on that bike. Other things, they used a 20-inch Dunlop alloy front rim, which is a very difficult thing to find. I was fortunate enough to find one of those. The front brake is a 8-inch with extra fins to try to improve the cooling, because in those days they didn't have disc brakes, and they try to get a bigger diameter brake to get better swept area and better braking power, and they used whatever they could with fins to try to keep the brakes cool. Other items, this uses a BTH TT magneto that was only used in some of the racing bikes. Some of the subsequent racing bikes of that era also used that, but it's a pretty unusual item. They use the megaphones for this, and Mike, you've heard this thing
yes,
when we've lit it off a few times, and it is really loud. I have a Bonneville TT that's straight pipes, and it's a bigger motor, but this 500cc motor with those megaphones, it sounds like a Ford V8.
It really does. I saw you down at Quail.
Quail, yeah.
That was an amazing show. I remember it being a cold, blustery, cold day.
Yes, it was.
And there you are in your jacket. Because I guess you had to start it, right? For part of the judging, right?
Yeah.
And I'm there. I just happened to come across you, and there you were.
Right.
Just in the middle of starting your bike. I remember it very well.
Right. Yeah, it was fun. So they tried to put all their go fast stuff they could on it. At the time, the sprung hub was the latest engineering innovation, so they put it on here. I think that probably was detrimental to the handling because we all know what the sprung hub's reputation is like. It doesn't really do much for handling, but they put it on there because they thought that was the latest and greatest race thing to do. So it's kind of an interesting mix of technologies here. They made this for 2 years, 1949 and 1950. You know, it's racing history. It had some victories, but it wasn't like it took over the whole scene. So after a couple of years, they stopped building it. But what they did do, because there was still enough demand for their customer base to go racing with these bikes, they built race kits. And many of you may have seen that. Came in a box with all the goodies in it. Basically, a lot of the stuff I've been describing on this bike came on that. And then you would use it with the T100 bike that came out, and it had the close fin aluminum barrels and head. And so you could bolt on all this race kit stuff. You'd have to put race cams in it, so you'd have to pull the motor apart to do that. The megaphones and some of the other items. So that was a very interesting piece that they did for a couple of years to try to satisfy the demands of the customer base. I think they only built the race kit maybe for a couple of years, but in '53 they came out with the T100C, which basically had a lot of these race components on the bike, but it was a street-going bike. It was a nacelle, and it had the headlight and tail light and all that, but it had the dual carbs, and it had the big oil tank, and you could put the megaphones on it, and a lot of those features which are unique to that 1 year. So it's kind of interesting to see how the whole evolution of these bikes in the race program. And then later on they had some other versions of this that went into dirt track racing and all that. So I might make a comment too about, I chose this number 43 here because in 1950, Rod Coates, who was the service manager for Triumph of Baltimore in the East, they were the Eastern distributor for Triumph. He got one of these and went racing in the amateur 100-mile race in Daytona, and he won it. And his number was 43, so I decided that would be an appropriate number to use since it has a lot of American history behind that. And I might make some other comment here. If you notice, this has what you would normally see with the primary case being aluminum primary case enclosing the primary chain and the clutch and all that. In Europe, they didn't have the primary chain. They just had it open. So you had the spinning gears and the chain. Yeah. And they also didn't have a Kickstarter. So you had to bump start them because in those days, the racing in Europe for the road racing was Le Mans start, where you have to line up, you run across the track, and then you get on the bike and you have to bump start it and get it going. That was the way they ran them. And so that was even lighter. But when they came to the US, AMA rules were such that you had to have a Kickstarter. So they had to put a Kickstarter on these. And this is an unusual Kickstarter because it's from the period, so it doesn't look like the ones you might find on a later pre-unit or unit Triumph. And because they raced these in Daytona, they put the enclosed primary case because at the time Daytona was raced on the beach and there's a lot of flying sand. So if you didn't have the chain enclosed, it would machine itself to death with all the sand in no time. So that's some of the history behind this bike, and this bike particularly is shown in David Galen's book on Triumph of America, is listed as one of the bikes that was shipped to Johnson Motors. So I don't know the history behind that. I suspect it may have been raced in Daytona, but I don't know for sure. My thought is maybe try to see if I could get access to some of the AMA racing records from that era, look up the numbers and see if I can see who might have raced it.
You've had it in the one show as well.
It's
a different kind of show, of course.
Yeah,
it's not a vintage show per se. It's more of a builder's show. But right. I remember seeing it there, and I've seen it around a lot. It's
also had it at the LeMay show. In the last year they had it in 2016, and it actually won the best show for that. Thing. So that was a nice thing to do. So it's totally impractical. You can't ride it on the street. Well, I take it up on my neighborhood, but I will ride it until the neighbors start calling the police, and then I have to go hide it again for a while. But it does make a lot of noise, so it's more fun for taking it out for shows and maybe doing at a racetrack where you could start it up and at least hear what it sounds like.
Have you given it some welly
Not
when you've
too
been
much.
riding?
Not too
okay.
much. Just haven't had much of an opportunity
No.
to do that. But maybe someday we'll do that.
That would be incredible, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Magic, absolutely magic, Tom.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming over and sharing this. It's nice to be able to share this with everybody, because it's, these are kind of rare bikes, and not everybody has had the opportunity to see them. And like I say, I didn't really know much about them until I ended up with one, and so went through a crash learning course on that.
They're like bulkheads, aren't they? In
Yeah,
a
they're
ship.
like little bulkheads right here. You can see there, and there's one on the other side of the tunnel.
Yes, I see. Yes. Well, it's dry, so you're not going to be starting it today then.
Probably
Tom.
not today, but maybe
another time, definitely.
we'll have to get it out and maybe do a spring start or something.
Do a ride along.
Have a little bit of a show that way.
That would be amazing. No, I'd love that.